I was going to make a Peyote stitch hairband with these number 11 Delica beads, and I thought I would go ahead and show you how to do that. Supplies I need are the beads, whatever colors you need. Excuse me. Beading thread, a beading needle. This beading needle is special because it's very thin and allows me to bead these very small beads. If you have larger beads, then you can use a larger needle. A pair of scissors and some wax. The wax is not necessary. I just like using it on the end of the thread so that it's easier for me to get through this very small eye in this needle. It also, you can coat it and it just helps the beads move along the thread a lot easier, but it's not necessary. And I'm also going to use a ruler so that I can measure how long I get started. The first thing I do when I take the thread, I kind of wrap it around my finger, and then I'm going to pull it just a little. You don't want to break it, but you want to do a pre-stretch. That way it doesn't stretch after you get the beads on it. So however much you want to start with, just kind of give it a tug so that it pre-stretches the string. And the next thing I'll do is take some of this wax and just kind of coat the end of the thread. Like I said, that's just to help me get it through this little tiny eye here. You can also use beeswax. And then the next thing I'm going to do is start putting the beads on. I want to make this 2 inches wide, so I'm going to get 2 inches worth of beads. Okay, so there's my first row. Well, technically it's a combination of the first and the second row because this is peyote stitch. When you're doing peyote stitch, the first couple of rows is going to be the most difficult because it's very wonky and doesn't stabilize very well until you've got a couple of rows on there. So now what we're going to do to start the next row, one bead at a time. You get one bead, and you're going to skip this first bead, and you're going to insert it into this next bead right here. And pull. So now what you have, sorry about that. Anyways, so we skipped the first bead, went through the second bead. Now we're going to skip this next bead and go into the fourth bead. So you're skipping the odd number beads and going into the even number beads. So this is the fourth bead. We're going to go into this one. You can kind of start seeing, let me see if I can zoom up here, kind of start seeing the pattern now. Of what it's doing. Pick up one bead, we've come out of this bead, so we're going to skip the next one and go into the following bead. This is not easy while I'm recording it, because normally I'm holding it in my hand. Actually, this is not easy doing on the flat table. Okay. And pull. And then adjust these beads. Now you have another set. Pick up one bead, skip the next one, and then go into the next one. So you can see the pattern. So I'm going to go ahead and go all the way to the end. Take this row here, takes a little time because you can see that it's very flimsy. It's not supported, and so take your time on this and make sure this gets done correctly. The rest of the rows after this will be a lot easier. One thing I kind of forgot to mention, when you're doing peyote stitch, it's much easier to have an even number of beads. You can do odd number, but that takes a little bit more, a lot more time because you have to weave stuff in and out on the last bead in order to get your placement of your needle right on the next row. And because of what I'm doing, it doesn't really matter. So when I got to the end, or near the end here, this last bead that I went through, you can see where both threads are coming through this last bead. There's an extra bead here. When we turn, we're going to be adding a bead onto it and then going back through the raised beads. So I'll be adding a bead here and going through this one, which means this is an odd bead. So for my design, it's just easier for me to take it off. So now that I have an even number, I'll take that bead that I just took off. I'm going to turn the work. Now what I'm going to do is start going through each one of these raised ones, like that. You can see how that bead is sitting there on that last one, making the next row. So now I'm going to pick up another bead. This is the one we just added. We went through this one. And I don't know, my camera's not taking very good pictures this morning. We'll go through the next raised bead. So each one of these gaps, you're going to add a bead and then go through the raised bead. After this next row is on, this should be really stable, and it's much easier to just hold it in your hand and go at a really good pace. After you get the rhythm down, this can go fairly quickly, but it is one bead at a time, so it's going to take longer than doing a loom a loom bead weave. And you might want to be sure you don't tangle your thread like I just did. There we go. Occasionally give it a tug just to tighten it up. You don't want them super tight, but you do want them snug so there's no gaps in between them. We'll skip the space and go into this one. Okay, and I'm going to complete it to the end of the row. I've completed that row. You can see how I've come out on the down bead so that when I add a bead and go through that next up bead, it will lock it into place. So this will be the next bead that gets added on, then through this bead, and then add a bead here. On this row I'm going to change colors. But it can also start holding it in my hand now because you can see it's a lot more stable and easy to hold and work with. When I get to the end of the row, I like to turn my work so that the thread is coming out the bottom and on the right hand side, so that as I add a bead, it's really easy for me to just grab that next raised bead. Just a little hard to do with the camera in the way. Okay, now that I've got this row on, you can see that there are two beads on this end with the beginning tail. So now what I'm going to do is I've moved my needle to this end and I'm going to just weave this tail end into this to get rid of it. And it's pretty easy to do. Just go through one bead at a time and just kind of zigzag it back and forth through here. I'll go out like so many beads and then I'll turn around and then I'll come back with it, and that locks it in. So it does not need to be knotted. You can see how I'm going through several at one time. With Peyote stitch this is easy to do because they're on an angle. When I come out of here, I'm going to drop straight down and then go through these two beads. And then drop straight down and go through these two beads. And turn around. And then make sure that you go straight, because if I was to go over to here or go back to here, then you're going to have this little loop of thread on there, and you don't want to do that. So be sure that you pull. You can see where the thread's coming out. Go straight up into that bead. so that you don't have excess thread hanging out. And then I can just cut it off. Now the tail end is out of the way. I'm getting near the end of my thread. It's good to do this at the end of a row. It's not necessary. As a matter of fact, you can change your thread at any point during your work. It's nicer if you can do it at the end of the row. The way I'm going to do this is I don't want to tie knots, so I'm going to weave it back into the work. So since it's coming out of this one right here, I'm going to go into the one right next to it. And then be sure that whenever you go into another bead, that your thread is going to be parallel. So since my thread is coming out after this first bead, I don't want to go into a third bead. I want to go into one of the second beads. And also, instead of just picking up one bead at a time like this, sometimes you can go into two beads. Like that. Once I go so far one way, I'll turn around and come back the other way. And like I said, be sure that your thread is coming straight down. There we go. It's coming straight down. And And now I'm just going to cut it off. Now to start a new thread, I'm going to do the same thing as I did in the beginning. I'm going to take my beading thread and I'm going to pre-stretch a certain length of it. You don't want to make your thread too long because it'll have a tendency to fray, because you're pulling this thread through these little holes over and over and over again, and so it'll eventually try to fray your thread. So don't make it too long, but make it long enough so that you can at least do some work before having to change it out again. So I'm going to pre-stretch this, and then what I just did to lock this end thread off, I'm going to redo in the opposite direction. So I'll weave the thread in so far, and then I'll turn around and then I'll weave it back out. And I'm going to come back out, actually this hole. And the way that you can tell is you want to come out the bead that's on the low end. If you come out this bead, it's high, which means if you add a bead onto it, you're going to be adding onto the upper parts instead of to the lower parts. So weave your thread back out to this low end bead, and then you can continue to add. Okay, so I've now weaved in the new thread. I'm coming out the low bead, not the high bead. And now I'm going to continue as I have been, picking up one bead at a time and going into the high bead. When you have long threads or threads that's been going through a lot of beads that start fraying, it will eventually start tangling. But the faster that you pull the thread through, the tighter that it's going to knot up, which makes it a lot harder. So when you have threads that have a tendency to tangle, pull the threads through slowly, and that will help ensure that the knots don't get so tight that you have to end up cutting your thread and restarting a new piece. When you do peyote stitch with Delica beads, it's kind of hard to see in this, but they're flat on the end instead of rounded like seed beads. That means that they bend very well in one direction and not the other. So with this, it's very flexible and bends very easily this way, because that's the way that these beads are laying. But it does not bend very easily this way, because these edges are straight. So if you wanted to make something that would bend in both directions easily, then use seed beads instead of Delica beads. Don't forget to give me a thumbs up and subscribe if you like these videos. Thank you.